I've done a lot of intergender matches in the past. Lately, I've been trying to get away from them only because I feel like I just have to wrestle more women. I feel like to up my resume wise, and to show other people like that I might work with in the future, like, hey, like this is my work, and show more matches with women rather than guys, because it is a little bit different, to be honest. So that is what I'm feeling like right now, is just wrestling more women. I will have an intergender match here and there, but not all the time anymore. But if there's like any like mixed tag belts, I think that would be a little bit, shaky, especially if it's going to be on TV.
Yeah.
Because people still, think about what that actually promotes for certain people. It might trigger certain people, which I get, totally understandable.
Yeah. Oklahoma.
Maybe let's not talk about them.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll keep it off TV if that. But like at the same time, I've seen it where like WWE in the past, when they have intergender matches, it's usually if the girl attacks the guy on the other side automatically has to come in. If we have it that way, maybe that would be a little bit better. But I don't know. It's all over the place because again, it is a little bit different. And I think like for a while I was doing intergender matches, and I was like, I don't know, I kind of want to wrestle more women again, because it's a different feeling. It's just like a whole different type of vibe for me personally.
All right, just for time's sake, I want to cut off there. But essentially, what Xenia Kai was going on to say is that one of the main reasons she wants to wrestle more women in not intergender matches or mixed tag matches is she wants to put up women's wrestling. And so my question, and this kind of comes off of a recent quote from Lita, she wants to see more interplay between the genders. Is it a society thing, or is it maybe a booking thing? But does it take away or add to women's wrestling to have intergender and mixed tags? Like, for example, if you have an intergender match, is it taking away from a women's match where you could have had two women instead of a man and a woman go at it? And what about the same thing with mixed tags, or is it just a matter of, as long as the booking is sound, go for it? And I'll start with J.Christian, and then Xenia, and then Angel.
To be honest, when I see intergender matches, mixed tag team matches nowadays, yeah, I do agree that it does take away from, women competing against women in the matches, or even women competing against men. Because when it comes down to the WWE, obviously you have to adhere to certain guidelines. You have to adhere to the fact that, unfortunately and sadly, domestic violence is prevalent, and hopefully the women in the relationship do seek the help that they need to escape those abusive relationships. But still, though, when it comes down to intergender wrestling, I do think it kind of takes away from, the interaction between competitors, especially considering the fact that if you see a good wrestling match between a man versus a man, or a woman versus a man, you'd have to figure, when are those ships gonna intertwine, so to speak? That's what I gotta say about that.
Well, I just remember one intergender match that Xenia Kai had with a unfortunate man that she did the Johnny Cage punch right to the bits and pieces, and that poor guy went down hard. Xenia, what are your thoughts? Where are you?
That guy, I can totally understand.
I wouldn't. I still hurt just thinking about it. Xenia, your thoughts on intergender matches and mixed tags? Does it add or take away from women?
So anyone who knows me knows I'm a huge proponent of intergender wrestling. Like that's the one thing that I've been talking about probably the most ever since I started doing anything at all in wrestling. Like ever since I started my YouTube channel, so for like almost 6 years at this point. The notion that intergender wrestling promotes domestic violence makes my blood boil. Like there's few things in wrestling discourse that anger me more than this, because in the same breath, people would tell you that domestic violence is not a gendered issue, which I disagree with. Like, yes, everyone can become a victim of domestic violence, unfortunately, and it does happen to men and does happen in male same-sex relationships. But ultimately and largely, domestic violence is a gendered issue. 90% of perpetrators are male and most victims are female. Like it's just the reality. Like it is a gendered issue. But then the same people who want to say that it's not turn around and say that intergender wrestling promotes domestic violence. Like, even in a reality where we do suspend disbelief, even in a reality where we look only specifically and totally at kayfabe, even in kayfabe, a pro wrestling match between two competitors or more of any gender is two consenting adults step into the ring to fight. How does that promote any kind of unbalanced dynamic? I don't know. And in the same way, like, for example, in kayfabe again, right? A male wrestler attacking a female wrestler backstage. Would that be bad? Yes. Would that be gruesome? Would that speak of their on-screen character as a bad person? Yes. But then a heel wrestler, a male heel wrestler, attacking a male babyface wrestler backstage. Does that also speak badly of their on-screen character? Yes, absolutely. Assault is bad. I think we've all established that, right? And that's why it's a heel move. I actually have a whole video on my YouTube channel. It's pretty old, but I stand by everything I said. It's called Hitting Women is Good in Wrestling. So a bit of a controversial title, but if you want to check it out,
great title, by the way.
I would highly suggest you check it out. And like, because I don't want to go on a whole tangent, because in that video I go into a very, very detailed explanation of why intergender wrestling is actually good. But in terms of holding space for women, that's actually a very good point. That an intergender match, depending on the promotion, depending on the booking, can take away from women's wrestling, because I know we've all seen those promotions that book an intergender match instead of a women's match. Like clearly that, is not a good thing. And in my worldview, the way I see it, all the tools that we have right now to facilitate women getting their spotlight in wrestling are done because we don't live in a perfect world, are done because we live in the patriarchy. And again, in 350 years, we wouldn't need those tools. So like, that's how I view like the reason that we even have like separate female or women's titles is because we live in a patriarchy. And if everything was mixed and we didn't have titles that are specifically for women, women just wouldn't get booked to win titles. Like it's the same way that like Pro Wrestling Illustrated 500 just came out just recently, right? And I love Pro Wrestling Illustrated. I know a lot of people in Pro Wrestling Illustrated. I think they do a massive body of work to even develop the 500 and the women's 250. And actually, last year compared to the year before that, they introduced the women's 250 as opposed to the women's 150 that they had before, which is also a great step towards, a great step in the right direction. But that's the same way. If we mixed everything like they did, they have a women's 250 and then they have a general 500. And then in the general 500, they have like 15 women or 20 women. Are you telling me those 250 women are all worse than those 500 men? That's just statistically unlikely. And from the standpoint of all of us, like we know wrestling and we watch wrestling, like that's not the case. But we live in the patriarchy. So when things get mixed, men get the advantage. And that's why we have to actively hold space for women. And in that regard, yes, if a promoter thinks that they can book an intergender match and skip on the women's match, it's clearly not a good thing. But in the perfect world, we would all mix and all get equal opportunities. But unfortunately, that's not the case.
And by the way, go to Xenia's channel, the XDT. Make sure you go to her channel. Check out that yes, women getting beat up by men in wrestling is good. I'm paraphrasing. And it's interesting you mentioned the word consensual too, consent, because I think even the same, to go back, focus fights, because you don't just talk about wrestling, you talk about MMA and whatnot. If there's a woman wanting to fight a man, if it's consensual, if they both consent to it, I mean, I don't know if that's should be as taboo. And we talk about if Moxley fights Harley Cameron, we're pretty much gonna see Moxley destroy Harley Cameron. I love Harley Cameron. She's great, athletic. She's really impressed me. She's one of my favorite.
But then again, if Moxley wrestles, say,
Masha Slamovich,
Commander,
that's a matchup
he's gonna destroy Commander too, even though he's male, and that doesn't mean he shouldn't be allowed to wrestle Commander. And
right.
I don't feel, I'm sorry, Jay, I'm gonna just quickly finish my thought. And in that regard, I don't feel as equipped talking about MMA, because I'm not an MMA expert and I'm not a sports journalist. I'm a wrestling journalist. But in wrestling, when there's no weight class, when there's no weigh-ins before the matches, when there's no title categories, when there's no physical comparisons between opponents the same way that there is in MMA, reach, weight, height, age. In wrestling, none of that matters. So in a universe where the Great Khali can wrestle Rey Mysterio, in the universe where Jon Moxley can wrestle Commander, in the universe where Nyla Rose can wrestle Red Velvet, why wouldn't a man wrestle a woman?
Yeah, but here's the thing. When it comes down to that analogy of Jon Moxley versus Harley Cameron, we know damn well that TNT, or really Warner Brothers Discovery, the parent company of TNT and TBS, wouldn't allow for that to happen. And especially in most athletic commissions, like Maryland, for instance, who still had to deal with the brunt of Vince versus Stephanie from 21 years ago in Baltimore, they would not allow that to happen. But when it comes down to the differences between pro wrestling and the sport that I cover mostly, MMA, is in MMA and in boxing, you do have weight categories, you do have title divisions, you do have, certain classifications to where fighters can only fight people who are either a couple of pounds heavier than them, or in the middleweight division, some 10 pounds heavier than them. But as far as pro wrestling goes, you can suspend all that disbelief and make things look, believable, so to speak, at least in some cases, which is why you would have some of these unbelievable matchups, which is why you would have some of these unbelievable scenarios or storylines, so to speak. But still, though, when it comes down to pro wrestling and MMA, there's some big differences, but at least in pro wrestling, you can suspend that disbelief. Angel, you got anything you want to say about this topic?
Yeah, no. So, it really depends on how you book it. Again, going back to that, if it were to add or take away from the women. But in some instances, it is a really good thing, but in others, it's why would you even make that an intergender match? You know what I mean? But I remember this one intergender. It was Rhea Ripley versus, I think it was Akira Tozawa, and at the time, that was perfect, because they kept going back and forth backstage. So then just making that a match that bring a lot of eyes back to that again, and they booked it perfectly. But then in other cases, it just doesn't make sense to book a woman and a man against each other. But I mean, it, for the most part, I don't think it takes away from a woman. It just really depends on how it's booked.
I feel like what I see even more of is a wrestling storyline where it makes perfect sense to book an intergender match, but they just won't because the network doesn't allow it. For me, I see a lot more of that. We had freaking Randy Orton and Nia Jax. We have Willow and Stokely Hathaway. We have freaking Willow and Brody King. There's been so many moments where it would make perfect sense to book two people in the match, and it just doesn't happen solely because of the different gender. And like one question that I have asked on social media, or like a rhetorical question, I guess, a bunch of times that makes people mad every time without fail for some reason, is give me one reason for why a male wrestler can't wrestle a female competitor that is not rooted in a notion that all women are inherently weaker and more fragile than all men. Like there is not a single reason that it does not boil down to that.